So welcome back to the final session on learning science. And we're going to go to stuff that was in the book, but isn't in the e-learning. Before we do that, I want to ask, were there any questions that arose from anything in the past week that you wanted to ask questions about or begin to find out before we go into the formal content for this last session?
I don't have any particular questions. I mean, I've enjoyed and benefited from all the overviews and the practice. So no, it's been good. I don't have any specific question. I kind of have a sort of a general thing, but it's not pertinent right now. Do your thing, and the first time later, I'll ask you.
There should be time later. Nothing from you, Prakar?
No,
I hope
no questions, Clark. Not at the moment. I'm just finding it really interesting to see what you're presenting and how that dovetails so well with what Ruth covered in her 3 sessions in terms of models and generative learning, and seeing how those 2 things combine. So no questions, but lots of interest.
Okay, no worries. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name right.
That's okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's go and start the actual formal thing. I've got my video window up here. I should move this. Well, let me start this into the formal mode. And hopefully you're looking at day 4 implications.
Yes.
And I'm going to make sure I open the chat window so I don't miss it. Good. So welcome back. Really, it says it's implications, but there's one thing I wanted to do before we went on. And so we've sort of gone through the human information processing loop in week 2. And in week 3, we went through learning specifics from our architecture. One of the things I realized some years ago now, but I've started beginning talking about it, is that a lot of our practices that we see in L&D are based on a model that we're formal logical reasoning beings. When we do semi-annual or annual reviews, there's a belief that doesn't matter how long it's been, we're formal logical reasoning beings will recall accurately that previous event and the feedback now, and we'll process it going forward. Our brains don't work that way. There's a belief that, if we get new information, we'll change our behavior. We can just give people information and presentations with bullet points. And that doesn't work. And the list goes on. And so I think there's sufficient evidence that A, that's true, that we are carrying over. And it was a view of cognitive science from the 50s to the 80s, roughly, that we were these formal logical reasoning beings. It's just that since then, we've realized differently. And I think, so I think there's evidence in L&D that this belief persists, and it's detrimental to our behavior. So what I want to do today, no, I don't want that. Is look a little bit what's coming. Well, really what I'm looking at is what have we found out about cognitive science since really since the 80s. And there was a revolution. This pair of books, Parallel Distributed Processing by Rumelhart and McClelland, they were the editors and they collected a bunch of papers. But really, there was growing evidence of what was called situated cognition, which would be the first framework we talk about, that our thinking isn't formal logical reasoning. And yet, the models people were using to model our cognition were based still on logic. So we were using things like if-then prologue as a logical language to model thinking. And we were a bunch of if-then rules and other forms of symbolic logic. And people were trying to adapt to that. And they created, Zalofty Zeta at Berkeley created fuzzy logic. And Doug Hofstadter of Gödel, Escher, and Bach was creating his slip nets. all these were ways to add some noise and some randomness and some different types of behaviors to form a logic to try and approximate human beings. And what Rumelhart McClellan did, Rumelhart had been one of these people who proposed one of these models of thinking like schemas. He called them schemas, Minsky called them frames, Schenck, talking about event-based reasoning instead of object-based reasoning, called them scripts. But everybody recognized we have these properties of knowledge, and yet Rumelhart got frustrated that none of the tools available would accurately reflect human behavior on these phenomena. So he came up with, he and McClellan, Jay McClellan and the research group started using neural models, neural nets, what they called connectionist models. And it's now 40 years later, and we're still using those as a major component of machine learning. So there was something there. And I want to talk about 4 different models of cognition that I think are important. So the first one we'll start with is situated or emergent. Then we're going to go to distributed, then we're going to go to social, and then we're going to go to emotional. So that's the path for now. And then at the end, we'll wrap up. The first one is that our cognition isn't fixed. When we were given a specific context to adapt, we don't respond the same in all contexts. That was a view that a formal logical reasoning would propose, but we have now robust evidence from behavioral economics and marketing and a bunch of other things that when we're presented with different contexts, that colors our thinking. And in fact, in our working memory, which is effectively where we do conscious thinking, the context and what we recall from long-term memory together interact to create our current consciousness. So it's very much emergent between what we know and what our current situation is. And you can see that, Beth Loftus did some research where she showed people videos of an accident. And she'd ask them afterwards, so she'd show them the video of the accident. And then afterwards, she asked, what do you recall? And with random variation, you got, typical recall for how much damage there was. She'd ask how much damage is there. But then she would ask a second group, they'd watch the same video. She asked them, besides the broken glass, what damage did you see? Now, if we were formal logical reasoning beings not affected by context, you would expect the recall to be the same. But in fact, the second group reported more damage, including broken glass. Interestingly, there was no broken glass in the video. Right? We're being affected by the information that's coming in. What this means practically for learning design, of course, is that if you need robust behavior across contexts, you want people to be able to deal with customers, the angry customer, the friendly customer, the passive aggressive customer, the ridiculous customer. If you need a consistent, you can't just assume that you can give people information, they will respond appropriately across all these contexts. You need to engineer learning that accounts for contexts. So supporting, our goals for learning should be twofold. Retention over time until it's needed. That's why we talked about spaced learning last week. And transfer to all appropriate, no inappropriate situations. That transfer is guided by the context we see in the examples and in the practice. We will transfer to a space defined by the context we have seen. So it's really important to choose contexts that will support appropriate transfer. And I'm doing this with a client right now, and yet it's surprisingly challenging to get people to understand that, to think about that, and to engineer that. So
I think this is what you mentioned in session 3 too, when you were talking about the process of abstraction, Clark, and making sure that the base is wide enough so that you're able to abstract enough to be able to apply and transfer to a situation that may not be exactly covered, but that process of the base is wide enough, for you to be able to abstract and transfer with some degree of success.
indeed, that's what I was talking about last week. And this sort of framework suggests why it's important. This facet of our cognition suggests why it's so important to choose the appropriate examples and practice in the span there. So thank you for resurrecting that and reactivating that. Yes, I'm having a useful effect. We're getting some persistent memory out of this. So absolutely, we are very vulnerable to changes in context and biases. And so, and we need to understand that in general, but because we don't want people to be influenced, but when we need to have robust performance, we absolutely need to be careful in our choices. So absolutely, good point. So unless there's any questions on that, I'm going to move on to the second aspect of cognition. No, we're good.
No
I'm just
question.
going to add that what I appreciate about Will Thalheimer's LTEM model is that he has decision making in there, and I think prior to decision making, there's something that gets on recognition. So like you can learn how to do something, the conditions which you might do it, but you have to practice it and recognize the opportunity in the real world, and then deal with all those different variables to make the right decision. So that's hard to get to in training. It takes a lot of work. Often people don't want to pay for it or see the value of it, but something we need to do.
Well, yeah, we've created expectations that training is easy, and if we just dump information, it's going to lead behavior. And because we don't measure our actual impact, we don't see this. But yeah, his LTEM model is designed to help us start recognizing that as we move up the chain, we want to start looking at actual persistent change in behaviors, and that leading to actual impact on the organization. And I like Van Marienboer's 4-component instructional design. It's very complex theory for complex cognitive skills, but it talks about two things: the knowledge you need and the complex decisions you apply that knowledge to. And I think that's exactly right, that you need to know the knowledge, but then that by itself isn't sufficient. You also need to then practice applying that knowledge in context so you recognize it. And I've recommend strongly using the term decisions as a way to get experts out of the knowledge thinking and into the actual performance issue. I think that's it. Because experts, we talked last week about how they compile their knowledge away and don't have access to what they actually do. How do we get them to unpack? Well, speaking in terms of decisions is one good way to cause that to happen. So thank you for that. So the second aspect that came out, and this really strongly came out from Ed Hutchins' work. He wrote the book Cognition in the Wild, and he looked at, I think his PhD thesis was on Polynesian navigation, and then he was working with the Navy looking at ship navigation. And he recites in the book about a particular incident, that the ship was coming back into San Diego Harbor. And San Diego Harbor, you probably don't know, but it comes in and it makes a bend. And you get to the anchorage where the Navy base is. The submarine base was over here, but the rest of the Navy base. And this was a surface ship. And as it came in, it lost power. Now, when you lose power, you not only lose your navigation instruments like your GPS and stuff, you also lose the power assist on steering like a car, but in this case, it's the rudder of the ship. So it becomes much harder to steer the ship. And steering ships, you may have heard the expression, it's like trying to turn the Queen Mary. Once you start turning, it takes a long time before that actually reaches an outcome. It's not like a car, you turn the wheel and the wheel turns. You turn the wheel and the ship starts moving in that direction, but it's really hard. So they were running a big risk. They had to know where they were, where the channel was. They had to be trying to control the ship. and they couldn't resort to their typical automated navigation tools. He talks about how they self-organized. So they had people out on the two wings of the bridge, and they had a map. And so what they would needed to do was take bearings on landmarks. And if they had two bearings, they could triangulate where they were, but they had to be synchronized at the exact time. So somebody else had to be looking at a clock, and this was a manual watch on their wrist, so it didn't run out of power with the ship's power. And the compass still spun because it's magnetic and based. So they could take the angles on the binoculars, which were on a platform that had a reading, so they could get the angle reading, and they could synchronize it by time. Somebody would call out the time, and then somebody would mark it on the map. And they were able to track where they were and figure out when to try and turn the rudder and do it manually. And at the end, they were able to successfully anchor. It also was very hard to stop the ship because ships keep going. There's not as much resistance in the water as there is on land, and they keep going. But they were eventually able to navigate that and get the ship safely anchored without running into anybody else, without damaging the ship, without anything. But what he recognized there was that the ship wasn't thinking, and no one person was doing the navigation. Navigation was distributed across people and representations. That the external representations played a part in the overall cognitive task of navigating the ship. And so he wrote the book Cognition in the Wild that talked about distributed cognition. And if you think about it, we use a lot of tools to support us. Why do we carry these things with us now so gleefully? Because they augment our brains and do things that our brains don't do well. Our brains are pattern matchers and meaning makers. And I think I made this point earlier in this course, that we're really good at pattern matching and meaning making. We're really bad at remembering arbitrary information, large amounts of information, executing procedures by rote. These devices are the exact opposite. So augmenting ourselves with the capability that our brains don't do well makes perfect sense. And so large amounts of information. Why do we use spreadsheets? Because that keeps complex formulas that we can't calculate in our head and keeps large amounts of data. When together, we're more formidable than alone. This tells us a couple things about what we need to do as designers. For one, don't try and put in the head large amounts of arbitrary rote information. We won't keep it well. And there is, as I mentioned last week, there is some randomness in our architecture, so we just can't do it. Design for putting information in the world when you can. And it turns out to do good learning, as we just talked about with, situated, the necessity of choosing appropriate contexts and having sufficient practice with those contexts to develop a repeatable ability to perform. We need also, it's hard to get stuff in the head. And so we should put it in the world when we can. And people always go, when you, Clark, you talk about how hard it is to get stuff in the head and how courses really need to be developed, and that's going to take more time and we don't have any more resources. Yeah, but quit putting everything in the head. Only put in the head what absolutely has to be there and put the rest in the world. And when I mean in the world, I mean externally, whether it's a checklist or a job aid or a lookup table or decision trees, wizards. There's lots of tools we use to augment our cognition. Do that first. I talk about working backwards. You work backwards from an ideal vision of what's in the world, what's in the head, and then you develop the what's in the world piece. And only then do you develop the training to put what's in the head, and you use the what's in the world piece as part of the training. So our brains do use distributed information. We do, and so we should plan on that, deliver on that. Part of this legacy of believing we're formological beings is that we can put everything in the head. and then we'll perform perfectly. And it's not true. It's not a valid or a viable assumption. And we should get rid of it and start thinking about how we really perform, and then optimizing that and augmenting our intellect. I'm much more interested in intelligence augmentation, IA, than I am in artificial intelligence. It's a tool to be used, but we don't have artificial general intelligence. And despite what a lot of people would like you to believe, we're a long ways from it. And I've been an AI groupie for decades, and trust me, this is true. So, you know, that's a map of New Orleans, but you can look up, you know, there are many different tools we use. And, you know, when I was talking about mobile learning, I'd ask people, how do you use that to make yourself smarter? People go, oh, I use maps. I put notes. I put events in my calendars. I snap pictures of my hotel room or my parking space in the airport garage, and on and on. All sorts of things our brains are really bad at. These things do well. That's it. That's the desire, is to find all the ways we can make people smarter without trying to put stuff in their head. Okay, before I move on, I want to pause there and say any questions that trigger any thoughts, any challenges, any barriers.
I have two thoughts. One is I often get stuck in this notion of distributed cognition, because I think about that as something that just takes place in the brain, and maybe I need to stretch my understanding of that a bit. But the other more practical question, I guess, maybe it's practical, is in recognizing that you can't hold everything in your head and some things need to be external. There's sort of a slippery slope that some people go down where they think everything needs to be external. You don't really need to know stuff because you can look it up. And I know you've talked about that before. Maybe it's a straw man argument. I don't know actually who's making that, or maybe it's just a few people. But I guess when you interact with, say, a client on this notion about what you externalize and what needs to be in the head, like, how do you navigate that conversation? Does that make any sense what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, you hear people don't need to learn anything anymore because they can look it up on Google, right? And no, knowledge by itself isn't sufficient. The ability to use that knowledge to make decisions is something we should. Again, we're pattern matchers and meaning makers. We should be, you know, I argue strongly, we should not make people trying to rote things. Let's automate everything we can. Let's save for us the important things that we do well. We do good decision making. We detect patterns with the right training. We can detect patterns and make good decisions. We train doctors better and better to use evidence to make good medical decisions, but they have to still make the diagnosis. That fatigues over time. The research Daniel Kahneman did about judges, you know, and showed that their decisions got more limited and narrower and more harsh as the day went on, because it takes cognitive resources. We should support judges in this too. And you should never go to a judge if you can after lunch. Always try and go in the morning. That's probably true. You probably want to see your doctor in the morning. I should remember that. I always like to go in the afternoon when the traffic's down, but maybe I shouldn't. The point being that there's no quick answer to how do you break it up. The real answer is, what do we do well and what does technology do well, and what is the optimal. When I talk about backwards design, which I just mentioned, I have a diagram I use. In fact, that's what got me my recent client. She loved that diagram so much. She said, well, that's what we want to do. You start with a vision of what the person is doing with others, with tools, and what is in their head, and figure out what would be the ideal design there. And then figure out, you know, then you document what has to be in the head and what can be in the world. And then you build what can be in the world. And then finally you develop training for what has to be in the head. And sometimes, you know, there are things that happen very infrequently. If it's not life-threatening, you just give them a job aid. So for, you know, installing a new piece of software, you only do once. You shouldn't have to learn it. You should just be guided in doing it. Versus things that you do frequently and you want to be polished at it, like dealing with customers, that should be in the head. How do you deal with customers? You don't want product information is an interesting challenge because you don't want to look stupid in front of the customer. But if you have, you know, a whole bunch of products you potentially could be relevant, trying to keep that in the head is crazy. If you can understand the category and stuff and make it an mixed initiative dialogue with them, yes. But so it's going to depend on, you know, the old consultant answer, and I mentioned earlier about spacing. It depends on how complex it is, how frequently it's performed, and how important it is. That's going to play a role here too. You think of pilots. Ideally, you'd automate those emergency responses, but because you can't, because you need reactions, they train hours a year for things they hope never to have happen. But it's really important when they do, and so they do this. But it's that trade-off of all those factors that determine what has to be in the head and what can be in the world. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. I just wanted to hear you kind of riff on that that notion. Yeah, it really does kind of depend on you know, when it is, the level of expertise people are coming in at, how critical it needs to be automated. Like in some cases, you can say the body of facts and case histories and stuff that can build up over time, and that's okay. For like a pilot, no. The first time you fly, you have to know it really well.
Right. Well, that's why you use simulations and scaffolding to get there. Microsoft Flight Simulator didn't start as a game. It became one, but it started as initial practice before you got on the more expensive simulators, before you went up actually in a plane with an instructor pilot. All that happens long before you ever go up in a plane by yourself. Exactly. So, good point. Prakar, did you have any questions or comments on this before we move on?
No really questions. I think still trying to, you know, there are just so many connections between what everyone's covering. And the other day, Julie was talking about information gaps, and, you know, is it really a skill if it doesn't need to be practiced? And so you think, well, you know, what can be distributed and what can stay in the learner's head? And there are different ways to approach and look at it. And I think to Rich's point, and I think it's a great question, even though we know all of this or have a sense of what it means, deciding at that point in time to what maybe make available as a job aid versus, you know, what kind of technical limitations exist in the learner's environment to be able to access that job aid when it's required. You know, all of those kinds of things then have a series of consequences to what actually ends up in front of that learner. So just sort of thinking through some of those things, and no specific questions, Clark.
No worries. Yeah, one of my mantras is there are no right answers, there are only trade-offs. And that's what we've got to navigate and make our best choices. And then we test it and see if it worked. All right. In which case, another revelation is that when information is distributed, in that story I told about the ship navigation, it wasn't just distributed across the external representations, it was also distributed across other people. And the old, you know, there's a whole bunch of cute little sayings that have emerged around this, you know, like we are smarter than me, or the room is smarter than the smartest person in the room. There's a caveat on that, by the way, if you manage the process right. If you don't manage the process right, the room is as smart as the most dominant person in the room or the person with the most authority or whatever. But if you manage the process right, the room is smarter than the smartest. And it's not just, it's no longer what you know, it's more who you know. So there's a lot of different things that are captured this essential element. And diversity matters. If you look at Amy Edmonds' stuff on the learning organization, and in particular, Garvin Edmondson and Gino, so she with two colleagues wrote an article for, I think, Harvard Business Review about the dimensions of learning organization. They outlined the elements that they had documented has contributed to a successful learning organization. And diversity is important. Complementary skills. You can't have all the skills necessary to solve certainly a large category of problems. If you look at the Kneffen model that talks about, there's simple problems, and then there's complicated problems, and there's complex problems, and there's chaos. Simple problems anybody can solve. Complicated problems, you bring in an expert. Complex problems, you need teams with complementary skills, and then you need to manage the process right. And with the internet timelines, we were talking about the coherent organization, about how you pulled people from different communities of practice together into a team to solve specific problems. And each of them comes from different communities of practice, so they bring different skills. And research says, by the way, that as long as, says two things. One, that diversity can be too much. If not everybody, what you need in addition to diversity is everybody has to share a commitment to the outcome. If you got that, diversity helps. If you don't have that, that's too much diversity. Also, for most problems, somewhere around 4 to 6 people is the right number. That's the most manageable size of a group. Sometimes you have problems that need more skills, bigger problems, what somebody once termed macro engineering projects. You may need bigger groups. Gets harder to manage, but you need those different skills. And Stan McChrystal in his book, Team of Teams, talked about how they actually had team representation at the top, and then they brought it back to their teams, and that distributed to other teams. So this hierarchy of teams, but not a hierarchy of people in that sense. And that was, they found it useful. But so we do need to understand the power of social. And I'm not sure I've made this point here, so I'll make it briefly now. Most of what we've been talking about for learning science and cognitive science holds true for formal learning. And when we go, as we were talking about with distributed information just a moment ago, going beyond just what's in the head to what's in the world, so that that's all about optimal execution of the things we know we have to do. And that has typically been L&D's bailiwick. I argue that in today's era of increasing change and increasing ambiguity, what they call VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complicated, and ambiguous, organizations are going to need more nimble. And they're finding that out, and they're trying out to find different ways to be innovative. And the question is, who in the organization has responsibility for that? And I have a stance on that, like most things. And it's triggered by this insight. When you do research to find, what's going on, or to find out new markets, new opportunities, when you do design to capitalize on that research, when you do troubleshooting to improve the outcomes of that design project or any design project, you don't know the answer when you start. By definition, that's what research is. It's finding answers. Design is finding solutions. Troubleshooting is finding answers. Therefore, they are learning. The only difference is there isn't anyone who can give you the answer, like with formal learning, but it's still learning. So I argue that who should be responsible should be L&D. We are supposed to be the ones who understand the most about learning, both formal and informal. And if we own that, we do. And that not only on principle makes sense, but pragmatically is really important, because that moves L&D from this periphery. L&D supports optimal execution, but we're executing well enough. These are tough times. We can get rid of L&D. We're just going to execute the way we know that's good enough. When times get better, maybe we'll reinstall L&D. Or when we're a startup, optimal execution, we're figuring it out. We don't need L&D. But if we're contributing to that most essential continual innovation, we suddenly move from being in the periphery to being the catalyst for the most important part that helps organizations not just survive, but thrive. So I strongly believe that a very strategic opportunity for L&D is to start figuring out how to tap into social. Now, social's actually extremely valuable for formal learning as well, because when you have anything that's ambiguous, and if you've ever taught, you recognize that no matter how well you construct the question or present the stuff, somebody finds a way to interpret it that you just had no expectation of it. If there's room for ambiguity, if there's room for different interpretations, having groups work together and generate an output that requires them to create a shared understanding, a unified understanding, is a really powerful mechanism to support accelerated learning, to help them share that. And then when they come back and share it, you have something tangible to comment on to help shape that thinking. And if you have more than one group, you can get them sharing, working in a small group and then share their output, and they can hear what the others did, and that will increase the learning as well. What it does is it triggers a lot of processing, and processing is elaboration, which leads to learning. So social is great for that, but it's really important for innovation. Again, bringing these complementary skills together and managing the process right. Turns out you don't want to, the original brainstorming, there were some articles a number of years ago in places like Fast Company and Wired that said brainstorming doesn't work. And the original model didn't. Because what it did is it said, you brought a bunch of people in a room together, you gave them the problem, and you had them start talking. That doesn't work, because the first person who speaks colors the thinking of everybody else. But if you give them the problem first, whether independently or in the room, but they don't share, they first have to generate all the ideas they can, then you get them to start talking. Then that diversity actually has them populate the space of possible solutions differently, because they're different, before you start sharing. And then you deliberately don't evaluate the outputs of what people say. You first use that to mix, this person thought of that, this person thought of this. Can they be put together and maybe give us another alternative? And then once you populate a whole big space of possible solutions, you increase the likelihood of finding the best solution. And then you can start evaluating, but you need to diverge before you converge. But if you follow the process right, the benefits of having diverse people in the room and working together to find answers is more productive. And the myth of the individual genius who goes away and comes and brings back the answer, that myth's been busted. You can look at Keith Sawyer's book, Group Genius. You can look at Stephen Berlin Johnson's Where Good Ideas Come From. He's, Keith Sawyer is actually a researcher. Stephen Berlin Johnson summarized research as a journalist. Both come to the same point. We're smarter when we work together. And so we should leverage that for formal learning when it's useful, because it does cost more. It takes effort to get people together in a room, even a virtual room. It takes some coordination, some timing, some things. But the benefits of it, when you need that knowledge negotiation, there's essentially no better way to do it. So that's the power of social. You guys with me so far? Any questions on that?
There's the
And that's
opportunity to rethink the L&D role as facilitator of people's learning, rather than someone who prepares and packages and delivers learning.
Absolutely. That's definitely a direction. I'm not the only one who's supporting that, saying we've got to stop moving to being the owner of all the information to be the facilitator of learning. And I think that's true for formal and informal learning, by the way. We facilitate getting information out of the experts. We facilitate learners coming to grips with the information. We don't create learning. Learning management system is a misnomer, right? You can't manage learning. You can't create learning. You can create an environment which supports learning. And that's an important distinction. So thanks. All right. Nothing else? We'll move on. You can chime in anytime. And we are emotional. that notion that we're formological carries over into the think that, oh, well, we should just keep our problems to ourselves. We should put our personal problems and our work problems aside and just do our job. And no, it turns out that if people don't have help with their emotional work, if we haven't made it a conducive environment that's free from bullying and harassment, where it's safe to be, where it's psychologically safe to contribute, you're not going to get the best out of people. I talk about the Miranda organization, where anything you say can and will be held against you. If that's where you work, that's not going to get your best efforts. You need to make it safe, and you need to make sure people not only feel welcome, but are dealing with their issues. If they're feeling stressed, you don't get their best. If they're feeling harassed, they don't get their best. If their personal life is a mess, you still don't get their best. And smart orgs are beginning to look into wellness programs that address not only making the workplace an effective and safe, good learning culture, but they're also helping people with outside issues, because that's how you care for people. And you can't, and we are learning that retaining people is cheaper than recruiting people. And people who feel like their company is vested, if you look at self-determination theory by DC and Ryan, that relatedness, that other people are caring about you and working with you to good ends, is a critical component. Not only that, but I talk about it as emotional part of learning, but really it's conative if we use the technical cognitive science term. We talk about affect, who we are as a person, and the best, that's largely personality, and MBTI and DISC and stuff are not good instruments to use. They are psychometrically and theoretically flawed. Ocean or Hexaco are a reputable approach. They're theory-free in the sense that they simply look for independent dimensions and then create labels for them, but they have done the factor analysis to identify that these are psychometrically valid and that they're independent. They're measuring different things. They are robust in that they are repeated over time. They're the minimal set, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of good things that determine it. But when I speak of emotion in terms of learning, I'm actually using it as a shorthand for not affective, but conative. That is your intent. That is to engage. That is your motivation. Any anxiety is an inhibitor of that. So you want to boost people's motivation. You want to remove anxiety. You want to build their confidence. So at the end, they go, to the level that after the learning experience, they're willing to at least try. And then we also need to think about following up with, coaches and supervisors watching and actively developing these skills on an ongoing basis, as opposed to immediately squelching it, which can happen if you don't prepare managers and supervisors for any learning intervention you do. But all this matters. It matters we know that people work better when they are in a learning culture. And we know that learning works better when people are engaged, motivated, and they're not anxious about the learning experience. And that's a whole separate topic in my latest book that I wrote for that purpose. But the point is, this is another factor of our cognition that we really need to incorporate thinking about explicitly in the design of our approaches, both formal and informal. And that's the 4 things I wanted to cover. Before, I'm happy to address any of those. And then we just go on to those subsequent questions. Anything surprising? What might you do differently? And what challenges might you face in trying to do something differently that maybe we can help with? But any questions on the emotional thing or any of the other things before we move on?
Yeah, I had a few thoughts on the emotional piece. Emotion, I think, means a lot of different things. And you kind of describe some different aspects of it. It's an emotional experience you have while you're learning. It's the feeling you have about the learning's importance, its relevance, your self-efficacy, related to self-determination theory, the degree to which stress or anxiety creates cognitive interference while you're learning. It seems like it goes off in a lot of different directions. Some are productive, maybe not. Like people say, make the learning emotional, but like you remember the emotional experience, but maybe not the content of what you learned, because the learning is emotional. But yet our emotions give us signals about things about our values and things that are important to pay attention to. It just seems like a real complex area that I haven't quite sorted out yet, like what I should pay attention to. And maybe it's just because it's new and it's emerging. I don't know where that's going, but that's just kind of what comes up in my head when you're talking about emotions.
Well, absolutely. And unfortunately, Nick Shackleton-Jones released a book called How People Learn, which is wrong. He said that, all we retain are the emotions about an experience. He created that up. He said a lot of good stuff about how important emotion is in learning. Absolutely. Couldn't, agree more. But then he based it on, he made up this theory of memory that said, all we remember are the emotions. And that can't be right, because then we would have nothing to reconstruct the memory from but the emotions. There have to be traces of some concrete thing. We have to remember the context. We have to remember the outcome. We have to remember stuff other than the emotions around it. So it can't be true. And so I blame him for muddying the water. There has been some interesting results in emotions. I put into the chat a book recently from Lisa Feldman Barrett called How Emotions Are Made that actually Matt and Will turned me on to. That's a rethink based on the predictive coding. I mentioned predictive coding when I talked about models last week. This notion that our brain is continually running and continually creating explanations of the world. And she uses research and then uses that as a theoretical framework to explain that a lot of the stuff we have about emotions is wrong. That when we think we can recognize emotions by expressions on people's face, nope, turns out that's not reliable. She has an example of Serena Williams with a credible expression on her face, and it's easy to interpret it as fear, and it turns out to be extreme joy. It just and she goes on and debunks a lot of the myths, and then talks about there are certain core emotions, and then most of our other emotional constructs are just that. We create them culturally, and different cultures have different terms and concepts for emotions, and they can feel them or we can't because we didn't culturally have them created for us. We don't have those concepts in our conception, which is kind of redundant, but okay. So emotions are interesting, yes. And I deliberately made clear that when I speak about emotions for designing learning, I'm talking more about motivation, anxiety, and confidence, which technically are not emotions. I use that shorthand to separate it from the cognitive stuff. And the picture is more complex. I simplify that way. But in DC and Rye's theory about motivation, they talk about autonomy, mastery, and relatedness or connectedness, and having given clear goals. And that's why the other author, whoever wrote, was it Stephen Johnson as well, who wrote Drive? Maybe. Talked about purpose. We need to understand the purpose of what we do and why that matters. And that is actually relatedness in DC and Ryan's, because he also had mastery and autonomy. But you need to be given something to do that is important, and then you need support to be able to succeed, depending on situated leadership talks about if the person's competent, you just stay out of the way. But if they're competent but not confident, you give them emotional coaching. If they're willing but not competent, you give them formal support in performance. And that's all true, but in the long term, you're developing them as you go along and doing this. So I think that's important components of making it work. By the way, the How Emotions Are Made book is controversial, but one of the things I liked about it is that predictive coding model. If you go try and look up Carl Fristoff or look it up on Wikipedia, it's incredibly complex. She doesn't make it simple, but it was the most comprehensible explanation of predictive coding I've read anywhere. So while it's not simple, at least it was comprehensible, and that's a difference. Thank you for that feedback. Anything else? Because otherwise, I just want to know, was any of this surprising or interesting, or I suppose I should ask relevant?
I think just going back to the conversation around emotions, it's interesting because like Rich said, emotions can be experienced before, after, during, and I think one of the things that I'm left with is how can we in learning be more deliberate around this, because there are just so many factors that determine how someone might be feeling, what their emotional state of mind might be, cultural nuances, workplace dynamics, and so many other things. So, to prevent this from being one of those microeconomic theories where all things remaining equal, then this would work. What is it that we can be more deliberate about? So you sort of narrowing it down, Clark, to thinking around anxiety, motivation, and competence is helpful. I guess it's also a case of the type of learning being developed. We tend to sometimes think that we're developing pieces of learning that straddle various points in an organization, that have a pre, post, and middle kind of thing. Sometimes it's just a one-off piece of learning that's sitting asynchronously somewhere. And, then the factors that you can control around that are so much more limited. And I know that there are a lot of other things then to think about that. But, it's all of those kinds of things that sort of going through my head. But I guess I'm left with, to be far more deliberate around the emotions piece, since I'm talking about that specifically, and to see what it is that I can control or I can influence or educate my stakeholders around some of these things to at least improve the chances.
Well, I argue, so I wrote the Make It Meaningful book as a complement to the learning science book, because I figured I believe that learning experience design is the elegant integration of learning science with engagement. And in there, I argue about you need a hook. You need to hook people initially. And that to me is you need them to go, I do need this. And I think you can set that up by showing the consequences of having or not having this information, the negative consequences of not having or the positive consequences of having this knowledge. Really, it's the what's in it for me. And then, of course, you need to land them. And that's the longer story that says that once you've got them hooked, the experience has to deliver on that promise, right? And so you need to make sure you have the right relevant material, the least material necessary to succeed. You need to have appropriate levels of challenge. You need to they need to recognize that the relevance of the context to them. There's a whole bunch of things that need to line up. What you said is absolutely right. Stuff can't stand on its own. It has to be resonant throughout the organization. If, the organization has to believe that diversity is important for any diversity training to really be able to have an impact. The whole organization truly has to believe that safety is an important issue. And this goes for things beyond just compliance things, but everything you do, depending on your organization, has to be clear. The learning has to be relevant. This habit we have of somebody asks for a course, we develop a course, and it just sits there on the LMS and nobody takes it, or if they go through it, it has no change in the business. We've got to stop doing that. Okay, that was an editorial soapbox. I'll get off it now. But that's good. Yes, I do encourage you strongly to explicitly consider emotion as part of the experience, and I think we can we can get people to commit to the experience if we help them see why it's relevant to them. Then I think we can get them to persist through the experience if they continue to have little, examples and practices that they go, I get how this connects to that bigger picture. And at the end they go, I have left with abilities that I didn't have before. Ideally we're transformative, that people come out going, I am somebody new because I have this capability I didn't have before, and I'm better able to serve other people now in some way. That I think it's doable. I think it's aspirational goal, but I think we know what it takes. We just have to make the commitment. So thank you for the commitment. So, going back, what can you do differently? What do you fear you can't do differently? And I noticed we're at the top of the hour. So anything else we can answer, but otherwise I just want to thank you. This is the 4th week. You've persisted through some of this and congratulations. I hope it's useful. I hope it does lead to some actual change in what you do and to better success for you.
Yeah, thank you. Like you'd asked what's surprising or challenge. Yeah, maybe I can't remember what the other thing was. Surprising. It's not surprising only because I participated in LDA and I engage with you and Will and recommend all the books and things that everyone in LDA recommends. So, but this 4-week series has reminded me, pushed me a little bit deeper, and hearing some stories of how other people approach it. It just gives me some ideas to think about how to integrate this in. Like when you have all this knowledge, you end up coming from a different place than a lot of other people come from. And so it's partly you're just trying to kind of pull in what you can here and there and hopefully be successful with it, and then convince others that, these are maybe some good principles to check our work against. So that's the challenge.
Well, no, that's good. I just thought I'd turn off the formal slides and we can have a little bit of a conversation, and then we'll turn off the official recording, and I'm happy to stick around for a while longer. But yes, please, that's what we hope. A little bit of continued exposure over time helps it stick better and gives you opportunity to consider, how do I make the change? Okay, I've made a little change. How do I expand upon it? How do I test it? Is it better, or do I need to re-understand? That's the type of outcome we look for, we wish for, we hope for, we try and engineer. So cool.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clark. I've always found this supremely interesting, and I'm willing to talk to anyone who's willing to listen. There aren't just too many people around me sometimes, but I'm very fortunate in the place that I work right now. It's an incredibly small team, and there are a lot of kind ears around me to at least listen to some of these things, and I think as Australia in particular, the pandemic as it hit here, there was recognition of the fact that when it comes to some of these distributed learning environments that have been so common elsewhere, let's say in the States or in parts of Europe and in some parts of the subcontinent and in Asia, here there were still strides to be made. And so as we tried to figure out what does good learning look like, there was an opportunity to chime in with some of this information and see how it could be applied. And so for me to go back and be continuously exposed to this and further my own understanding is a brilliant opportunity. So I genuinely enjoy being here, and I think I learn equally from the number of people who join in these sessions and have their own thoughts. It's incredible to see different solutions to problems that that I might be facing, and to see how someone else has tried to resolve them. So it's great. I think this is fantastic. Thank you. And thanks to you too, Rich. I really enjoy listening to you and your questions, not just in this session, your reflections, but in some of the other sessions too.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
We're a good
I
group
will
here at
note,
LDA.
I will note, and then I'll stop the recording. It's ironic because Australia has been a leader in distance education. And this starts from way back in the School of the Air, where they were using radio to reach kids out on remote stations to help them continue their schooling, despite the fact that they were nowhere near an actual classroom. And then some of the early, I'm going to forget the term, audio graphics, where they would have narrated, they'd capture audio and images, so effectively narrated slideshows. But that was a very low bandwidth way of conducting actually fairly effective education. They didn't have a live face because they didn't have bandwidth for it, but they recognized the value of audio, which had much lower bandwidth requirements and its succession of images. So, and some of the top people in the world I think of are, she's retired now, Sandra Wills, but Shirley Alexander and Ron Oliver and Jan, why am I blanking on her surname? She and Ron wrote a number of papers with Tom Reeves, who's another girl. But anyways, fabulous environment. I'm going to stop the recording at this point, so people who haven't been here don't have to listen to us, Nat, or on any further, but I'll happily stick around. Thanks.